The year was 1962. The world held its breath. The Cold War, a simmering conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, threatened to boil over. At the heart of this potential inferno was a small island nation, Cuba. The discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba capable of striking the US mainland was a shockwave. The world watched, horrified, as two superpowers squared off, their fingers hovering over the nuclear trigger. For 13 long days in October, the world teetered on the brink. Families huddled in fear, schoolchildren practiced duck-and-cover drills, and the weight of impending doom pressed down on every shoulder. The Cuban Missile Crisis, as it came to be known, was a defining moment in human history. It was a stark reminder of the destructive power we possessed and the urgent need to find a path to peace. This is the story of those 13 days, a story of fear, courage and survival. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to subscribe and share to stay updated with more historical retellings. To understand the Cuban Missile Crisis, one must first understand the global chessboard on which it played out. The Cold War was an ideological struggle between capitalism and communism. The United States, a champion of democracy and free markets, found itself locked in a bitter rivalry with the Soviet Union, a communist state ruled with an iron fist. Both superpowers, armed with vast nuclear arsenals, engaged in a dangerous game of brinksmanship. Proxy wars erupted across the globe, each side vying for influence and control. Espionage was rampant, and mistrust ran deep. Cuba, a small island nation just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, became a pawn in this high-stakes game. Fidel Castro's communist revolution in 1959 had overthrown the US-backed Batista regime, sending shockwaves through Washington. The US responded with attempts to isolate and undermine Castro's regime, including a disastrous CIA-backed invasion attempt at the Bay of Pigs in 1961. The stage was set for a confrontation that would push the world to the brink. Fidel Castro's Cuba became a focal point in the Cold War. The young revolutionary, having overthrown the corrupt Batista regime, promised social justice and economic equality for the Cuban people. His alignment with the Soviet Union, however, would have far-reaching consequences. Facing relentless pressure from the US, he turned to the Soviets for economic and military aid. The presence of Soviet advisors and technicians in Cuba became increasingly visible, raising alarm bells in Washington. The Cuban people, caught in the middle of this geopolitical tug-of-war, faced uncertainty and fear. The decision to allow Soviet nuclear missiles on Cuban soil was a gamble, a desperate attempt to deter another US invasion. This fateful decision would have profound implications for Cuba and the world, bringing the planet perilously close to nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis was not just a clash of ideologies and military might, it was a human drama that unfolded on a global stage. Behind the closed doors of power, individuals grappled with decisions that had the potential to end civilization as we knew it. In the US, President John F. Kennedy faced an unprecedented challenge. His advisors were divided, some advocating for a full-scale invasion of Cuba, others urging restraint. Soviet submarine captain Vasily Arkhipov, stationed off the coast of Cuba, found himself in an equally perilous situation. With US destroyers surrounding his submarine, he refused to authorize the launch of a nuclear torpedo, a decision that likely saved the world from nuclear war. His story highlights the courage and clear thinking of individuals who resisted the rush to conflict. In Cuba, ordinary citizens lived in fear of a US invasion. Their stories remind us that it is ordinary people who bear the brunt of geopolitical conflicts. The discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba on October 14, 1962, triggered a chain of events that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. For 13 tense days, the world held its breath as the US and the Soviet Union engaged in a dangerous game of brinksmanship.
President Kennedy, determined to remove the missiles from Cuba, imposed a naval blockade on the island, preventing Soviet ships from delivering additional military equipment.
In Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev faced intense pressure from his own military commanders. The world held its breath as messages flew back and forth between Washington and Moscow, each side aware of the catastrophic consequences of miscalculation.
The doomsday clock ticked closer to midnight than ever before, a stark reminder of the fragility of peace and the ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation. As tensions reached a fever pitch, both sides began to recognize the terrifying stakes of the crisis.
Cooler heads, though tested, ultimately prevailed. Through a series of back-channel negotiations, Kennedy and Khrushchev found a way out of the impasse.
The Soviets agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade the island. Secretly, the U.S. also agreed to remove its own Jupiter missiles from Turkey, missiles that posed a similar threat to the Soviet Union.
On October 28, 1962, the crisis came to an end. Khrushchev announced the withdrawal of Soviet missiles from Cuba, and the world breathed a collective sigh of relief. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a watershed moment in human history.
The lessons of that harrowing confrontation, however, are as relevant today as they were in 1962. The crisis underscored the importance of clear communication, especially in times of heightened tension. Misunderstandings and miscalculations can have catastrophic consequences, particularly when nuclear weapons are involved.
The establishment of a direct hotline between Washington and Moscow after the crisis was a testament to this understanding. The crisis also highlighted the need for diplomacy and restraint. The fact that disaster was averted is a testament to the power of dialogue and the courage of leaders who chose negotiation over confrontation. More than 6 decades after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the threat of nuclear war still hangs over humanity.
The Cuban Missile Crisis serves as a chilling reminder that nuclear war is not an abstract concept, but a very real possibility. The consequences of such a conflict would be catastrophic, extending far beyond the initial targets.
We must remember the fear, the uncertainty, and the very real possibility of annihilation that gripped the world during those 13 tense days in October 1962. We must remember the courage of leaders who chose diplomacy over destruction, dialogue over devastation.
The Cuban Missile Crisis should serve as a stark warning from history, a reminder that the path to peace is fraught with danger, but it is a path we must choose. The future of humanity depends on it. We must find a way to live together on this planet, not as adversaries locked in a perpetual struggle for dominance, but as fellow citizens of a shared world, committed to preserving our common future.
If you found this video insightful, please subscribe to our channel and share it with others. Together, we can spread awareness and work towards a safer, more peaceful world.